Mr. Shakespeare, you are a crow. Thus spoke Robert Greene, but Dr. Samuel Johnson called Shakespeare a comprehensive genius. I'm Dr. Jayogene and I release videos that make literary criticism fun and memorable. So please subscribe to my channel and remember to hit the bell icon to get notifications whenever I release a new video. Oh, and by the way, I have included chapters in this video. So if you scroll along the timeline, you will see different sections for this video. The first half of this video is devoted to the text of Preface to Shakespeare, and the second half is devoted to my modern takeaways on Dr. Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare. In A Groat's Worth of Wit, Robert Greene calls Shakespeare an upstart crow beautified with our feathers. By our feathers, he means the feathers of the university wits like him. He and others like Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Lodge, all of them studied in universities, and so they are known as university wits. But Shakespeare was unschooled and had not studied in a university. There's a whole series known by the title Upstart Crow, and it is about Shakespeare. Dr. Samuel Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare put Shakespeare on the world map. It is one of the most important pieces of criticism which forefronted Shakespeare's genius. Dr. Samuel Johnson said that Shakespeare presented a mirror to life with his understanding of human nature and behavior. By the way, in this video, whenever I put text within quotes, that means it is a quote from Dr. Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare. Dr. Johnson calls Shakespeare a man of nature. While a correct and more accurate poet like Addison could be likened to a garden that is perfectly tended to and perfectly pruned, Shakespeare was like a forest full of flowers, humongous oak trees and the weeds. If other more correct poets were like cabinets of perfectly carved precious stones, Shakespeare was a minefield which contained diamonds, gold and the impurities of the ores. So if other poets are like culture, Shakespeare is like nature. Culture versus nature. Shakespeare was very humble in a sense, because he never imagined that his writings would be read beyond his time. He produced and wrote for the stage, for his audiences and for his personal ambitions. But he never assumed that he would outlast a century. So much so that he never collected his scripts. It is two other actors named Hemming and Condell who actually compiled his plays together. In a previous video on neoclassicism, I had talked about how John Dryden and Dr. Samuel Johnson supported the rule-breaking Shakespeare. Please do watch that video. I'll put a link up here. I talk about how the neoclassicists follow the fathers with a twist. So please do watch that video after this. Shakespeare broke many of the ancient rules, the rules of the unities of time, place and action, and happily got away with it. While Dr. Samuel Johnson does support the unity of action, a plot should be tight and right, he didn't mind that Shakespeare defied the other two unities. In fact, Dr. Johnson says the two unities can be replaced by the two beauties. The two unities of time and place can be replaced by the two beauties of instruction and variety. This is something similar to what Philip Sidney says in his Apology for Poetry. He talks about the merits of poetry or storytelling. And the purpose of poetry and storytelling is to teach and to delight.
Teachers delight, delight to teach, teach to delight, delight and teach.
I've also created a video on that. We can relate Dr. Johnson's two beauties to Philip Sidney's theory of delighting and teaching. Dr. Johnson's instruction is related to Philip Sidney's to teach. Dr. Johnson's variety is related to Philip Sidney's delight. Dr. Johnson says, all pleasure comes from variety. So you see the correlation between variety and delight. More on that on my modern takeaways, so please watch till the end. Now, before I go into my modern takeaways from Dr. Johnson's Preface to Shakespeare and the merits that he saw in Shakespeare, I talk about the flaws of Shakespeare. Dr. Samuel Johnson detected almost 5 flaws in Shakespeare. Some of his plays, especially the problem plays, have problematic morality. In Troilus and Cressida, Cressida ditches Troilus when she moves on to the Greek side and pursues Diomed. Similarly, in Antony and Cleopatra, Antony is already in love with the amorous Cleopatra when he agrees to marry Octavia. Shakespeare abounds with sexual jokes, but we may not always realize it. Eric Partridge has released a whole book called Shakespeare's Body. Body as in B-A-W-D-Y, which means sexual jokes. Some of the common titles that we take for granted, like for instance, Much Ado About Nothing, has a second naughty meaning. Juliet's last words just before she dies in the play Romeo and Juliet. "Oh, happy dagger, this is thy sheath, and let me die." These seemingly tragic lines also contains an innuendo. Anachronism. Anachronism is a mismatch between the time periods. So, Julius Caesar features a clock. That is an anachronism. Prince Hamlet studied in the University of Wittenberg, which is also an anachronism, because the University of Wittenberg, Germany, was founded in 1502, almost 100 years after the setting of the play Hamlet. Quibbles. Quibbles are puns and wordplay. Shakespeare loved quibbling. Dr. Johnson says that quibbles were a fatal Cleopatra, a golden apple for which Shakespeare would do anything. So if you read his plays, every now and then you cross a quibble. Take this for instance. "And now remains that we find out the cause of this effect, or rather say, the cause of this defect. For this effect, defective comes by cause." These are lines from the play Hamlet, Act 2, Scene 2, line 1029, where Polonius talks about Hamlet's madness to King Claudius and Queen Gertrude. And flaw number 5 is loose plots. Dr. Johnson may be trying to say that Shakespeare defied the unity of action in many of his plays. Now, I'd like to know your views on these flaws detected by Samuel Johnson in Shakespeare. Do you really think that they are flaws worth mentioning? Let me know in the comments. I think that while stories should be ethical and should represent morality, once in a while it's okay to show a bit of deviant psychology, at least to educate people on the various aspects of human psychology and human character. I mean, people should know that such people also exist in society. And I also believe it's okay to play with words and quibbles and the timelines and get creative with jokes. So let me know in the comments, do you think that these flaws detected by Dr. Samuel Johnson are that serious? I will be there on video release day looking and responding to all your comments. Now, what are the merits of Shakespeare? In fact, Dr. Samuel Johnson defends Shakespeare on 2 aspects. If you are preparing for an exam in English literature or are preparing for a competitive exam like NET, please remember these 2 aspects. Dr. Samuel Johnson defended Shakespeare's defiance of the 2 unities and his creation of the tragicomedy. Okay, let's move on to the much awaited takeaways. I always see an increased watch time in these sections of my videos. So here we are.
My modern takeaways from Preface to Shakespeare.
Begin with the popular. This is especially true for teachers and other kinds of communicators, because teachers tend to get very academic and intellectual. While it is good to be academic and intellectual, and this is also what other neoclassicals thought, Shakespeare did just the opposite. He always began his plays with the popular. Shakespeare was very careful to please the groundlings in his theatres, because otherwise these groundlings would be throwing tomatoes and eggs in the actors' faces. He included a lot of show and spectacle. As Dr. Johnson says, Shakespeare began with something that appeals to the eyes, and then he would take the audiences on a journey to something that appeals to the ears through his dialogue and script. And when their attention wanes, he would go back to spectacle which would appeal to their eyes. So it's always from eyes to ears and back to eyes. Shakespeare also picked so many stories which were already existing in the public imagination. He wanted to make sure that the audiences already carried the thread of the story before they came to the theatres. So much so that he was accused of plagiarism and copying from many of his contemporaries and his predecessors. Remember that Robert Greene called him an upstart crow, beautified with their feathers, the feathers of the university wits? Pattern interrupts. Now, this is very important to retain the attention of our audiences. As a YouTube creator and teacher, I have to constantly think of ways to interrupt my normal pattern. So I can add text, I can put up a picture, I can zoom in and zoom out, or add some weird music. Students who have studied with me know my sleep-shattering laughter. Yeah, something like that. All of this helps to interrupt the patterns, and Shakespeare was a master of interrupting patterns, or passions, as Dr. Johnson would say. This is why we have a drunken porter doing something of a stand-up comedy in a tragic Macbeth.
If a man were a portrait of Hellgate, he should have all turning the key.
Shakespeare mixed tragedy with comedy. I already mentioned this in my previous video on neoclassicism. Please do go watch that video after this. Shakespeare was also accused of defying the unities of time and place. But Dr. Johnson supported this. Dr. Johnson says, a mind wandering in ecstasy will not count the clock. He also says, all pleasure consists in variety. So teachers, please remember to interrupt your patterns. Be resourceful. Shakespeare began as a poor man, a needy adventurer, as Dr. Johnson would call him, who came to London to make his fortune. As Ben Jonson said, Shakespeare knew small Latin and less Greek. He lacked formal classical education, yet he was immensely resourceful. He started out as a stable boy, went on to become an actor, a scriptwriter, and eventually turned out to become a shareholder in an acting company, Lord Chamberlain's Men. This is an important takeaway for the coming generations because with the changing structures in employment and globalization and automation and the COVID situation, coming generations will have to learn to be resourceful. Adam Davidson, an American economic journalist, says that we are ushering in a new kind of economy, a passion economy. And he has released a whole series of podcasts on this. You can go check out his podcast after this video. Mastery takes time. Shakespeare began writing at approximately the age of 25 and he continued writing almost till he was 50. So he spent a quarter of a century writing and perfecting his craft. So anything worthwhile actually takes a very long time, be it a skill or evolving a business. It takes a very long time and we have to be very patient. The two Shakespeare movies, the 1998 movie of Shakespeare in Love and the 2018 movie, All Is True, captures this evolution of Shakespeare beautifully. In Shakespeare in Love, we see a young Shakespeare who is impetuous and idealistic and youthful. And he's just at the beginning of his writing career and he's struggling with the script of Romeo and Juliet.
Who is she?
Dream on, Will.
I heard you were a poet.
I was a poet till now.
But when we come to All Is True, we see a much more older and wiser and maturer Shakespeare of about 50 years after he left his writing career. It shows the burning of the Globe Theatre in 1613 and how he returns back to his family in Stratford.
And if you're honest with yourself, then whatever you write, all is true.
This movie captures many of the themes of his final plays. Pericles, The Tempest, Cymbeline. All these plays talk about ambitious men who are redeemed by their daughters. The movie talks about his relationship with his daughter and how they force him to introspect about his life and career. So there you have it. So these were my modern takeaways from Dr. Samuel Johnson's preface to Shakespeare. You may have noticed that all of them relate to communication because Shakespeare was a communicator and a master communicator. And I'm also a communicator because I'm a teacher and a YouTube creator. So I'm constantly struggling with how do I make the academic popular, how do I interrupt my pattern, how do I be resourceful. And YouTube, unlike Facebook or Instagram, is a long-term haul. I am constantly working on my skills of video editing, script writing, voice modulation. So my question is,
Which was your biggest takeaway?
no, that's not it. That's my usual question. So my question is, can you relate these takeaways to any field that you are working on? I can think of one right now, cooking. In cooking, I have to begin with the popular taste and gradually evolve and take my audiences or my family to healthy cooking or healthy eating. And I always have to interrupt my own patterns. Like if I cook chili, then maybe next day sour and next day sweet. I have to keep being resourceful. So that's my question to you. Can you apply these takeaways to any other field that you are working on? Please write to me in the comments. As I said, I will be there in the comments on the video release day. I will be looking at your comments and responding. So please be sure to respond. You can watch my video on Philip Sidney's Apology for Poetry and neoclassicism. Stay tuned for another modern takeaway next week.